Thank you very much for that introduction, Charlie, and thank you for the great partnership that, as you say, we've had. I've really enjoyed doing this work, and I hope that you guys find it interesting and informative, and that it actually goes out and makes a difference. So, I hope this work actually needs no motivation. It's important that men and women doing the same work are paid equally. But just in case you feel like this does need some more motivation, why do we think this might be a problem in the medical profession? So a series of research, including a lot that's been done by Charlotte here, has shown that women do face some challenges in the medical profession that are not faced by their male colleagues. So, for instance, in New Zealand, we find that female specialists are more likely to report being bullied on the job. They're more likely to experience burnout. And a lot of research, both in New Zealand and overseas, shows that female medical specialists face greater work-life conflicts than their male colleagues. At the same time, more is expected of women. They're likely to be mistaken for nurses as opposed to being recognised as doctors. And this may put actually a higher pressure on them to overperform relative to their male colleagues. At the same time, they actually may receive less support from their colleagues, from other staff in their workplaces. So this is a lot of things that are going on in the medical profession that are not wages. But do these inequalities, do they carry over to wages, or is that the one place where equality actually is maintained? Sorry, before I go on, can I go back? Sorry about the technical difficulties, it's new technology for me. So just let me point out this graph to you. So it's a little bit of motivation. I want to say, okay, so what do the data look like in terms of the hourly wages of men and women? So these are the median hourly wages, the mean hourly wages of men and women in their main DHB jobs in 2013. And you can see here, this is plotted against age, so it runs from sort of 20s up to age 70, separately for men and women. And the solid and the dotted lines in the middle here, so this is the average, and then that band that you see, that's the 95% confidence interval. So how sure are we that that's the average salary of these individuals? And so this is not adjusted for anything, and there may be many reasons for the differences that we see here, but a few things leap out. Men and women early in their careers, they seem to have relatively equal wages. They both experience a lot of wage growth, particularly during the 30s. This flattens off after a while, but it flattens off at a much higher level for men than for women. So a lot of what I'm going to show you in this research is trying to understand, are there good reasons for this gap, or is it unjustified? All right, so that brings me to the research question. So the question that I'm addressing is, does gender affect the hourly wages of New Zealand medical specialists in their DHB employment? So just to bring a few points about this to your attention, so I'm going to focus on 2013 for data reasons. So this is the year that we could get good comprehensive data on the entire medical workforce. I'm only going to be looking at wages in DHB employment. So this is the employment that falls under the scope of ASMS's MECA. One question that comes up whenever we start talking about these issues is, well, what about specialty? What if women just choose to work in specialties that get paid less? So most of this analysis is comparing within specialties. So do men and women with equal experience in the same specialty earn the same amount? In terms of experience is obviously really important, and the MECA does specify that more experienced doctors should receive higher wages. And so in this analysis, we control either for age or for other measures of experience to make sure we're comparing like with like. And finally, doctors who work different numbers of hours per week, there are a number of reasons to think that they might earn different hourly wages, and so in some of our analysis, we're also going to control for this. And then the final part of the research question is, what sorts of characteristics of specialists are associated with a higher or a larger or a smaller gender wage gap? So I'm not going to keep you in suspense about the results. This is a very brief summary of where I'm going to get to. So in their DHB employment, we find that women earn 12.5% less per hour than men in the same specialty after accounting for their age or their experience and the weekly hours that they work. So if they're statistically minded among you, this is really statistically significant. So the 95% confidence interval ranges from 9.9% to 15.1%. So 12.5%, maybe not the exact number, but it's very long way from zero. It's really hard to imagine how this actually could be a zero wage gap. When we look at the particular groups, we have a larger gap. We find that this gap is larger among older specialists, as we might expect when we saw that graph just of the raw data at the start. It's larger among those who work fewer hours per week, and it's a lot larger among parents. And I'm going to walk you through how I got to these results and hopefully convince you that these are true. One final protest might be, well, men at the same age have more experience than women. So we do a number of different things to try and adjust for this, and we find, sure, if you go to the extreme and maximally adjust for differential experience at the same age, then we can reduce the estimated gender gap by a maximum of 20%, but I think that's actually an over-adjustment, so I think the true adjustment is probably smaller than that. So just let me start off by putting this in context of gender inequality more broadly. So across all men and women working in New Zealand, Statistics New Zealand found that in 2018, the median hourly wage of women was 9.2% lower than that of men. So across the economy, on average, of course not controlling for anything such as experience or education or occupation, women are still earning less than men. Part of the reason is that women do tend to work in occupations that pay less, but even within occupations, women with the same experience, with the same skills, tend to get paid less than their male colleagues. Some research, including some of my prior research, has showed that this gender wage gap tends to be higher in the high-skilled occupations. So among high-income individuals, people who are really educated, really skilled and highly skilled jobs, the gender wage gap does tend to be larger. So to my knowledge, no research, particularly on doctors or medical specialists, has been done in New Zealand, but there has been some research internationally, and it tends to find that there does seem to be a fairly large gender wage gap, actually usually larger than the 12.5% that we find. So in some studies it's been in the sort of 13 to 20% range, but it does seem that internationally this does seem to be an issue. So I feel a little bit silly talking to a bunch of people who I know a lot more about this than I do, but I can't really talk about the gender wage gap within the medical profession without just giving you a few little pieces of background about, so sort of setting the context. So the context that I'm talking about is DHB employment. So obviously we have 20 DHBs and a lot of doctors are employed by these DHBs, not all doctors, and some doctors who are employed by DHB may have other employment, which could be with another employer in the private sector or maybe a private practice. So again, I don't want to talk about this in too much detail. I'm sure you're all aware of the long, lengthy process and training apprenticeship that doctors go through to receive, to become registered as specialists and work in New Zealand. Partly relevant for what we're talking about here, so I know there are a lot of international medical graduates, both people who receive their basic medical degrees and people who did specialist training overseas. They're a really important part of the New Zealand medical workforce, and we do specifically look at them in the study. So they have to go through different processes to receive their registration in New Zealand. And I know that it's not an automatic thing, so it's judged on a per-person basis. What are your qualifications? How does that compare with the experience of New Zealand trained doctors? And they may be registered for as specialists, or there may be some probationary period, or they may just never go beyond becoming a medical officer. And finally, well, we're at ASMS conference, and I'm sure you all know what ASMS is. Obviously, it's a really important part of the landscape for medical specialists in New Zealand. I should say, so 90%, according to ASMS, 90% of the senior medical and dental staff employed in the public hospital system are members, which is really good. And it's sort of these people that I'm focusing on. So I'm sure you're also aware of the MECA, which specifies a number of things which are relevant for the study. So this is obviously in place for the DHB employment of all members, and it's also extended to non-members under some circumstances. So in particular, it specifies a minimum pay level for each level of experience of a specialist. And under normal circumstances, a specialist will progress up one step of this pay scale each year, and it does seem like it has to be fairly abnormal circumstances for that to not happen. Importantly, individuals who are on parental leave for up to a year will receive the same pay increases as those who are not on parental leave. But finally, the MECA does allow for some additional payments, so recruitment and retention payments and special contribution payments that may recognise additional things that are so additional skills or dealing with issues in terms of keeping medical staff in, say, remote locations that doctors may receive as part of this MECA. So I am going to be presenting to you some analysis that uses Statistics New Zealand's confidential data. So all of the access to these data were managed under the confidentiality provisions of the Statistics Act 1975, and they're not official statistics, they are my research and Bronwyn's research, and our opinion and not the opinion of anybody else. All right, so let me just walk you through how what the data sources were and how we put our variables together. So our main source of data was the Integrated Data Infrastructure, or the IDI, which is a large administrative data set held by Statistics New Zealand. So data from a lot of administrative systems in the economy, like the tax system, the education system, and various other places, are pulled into this large data source, and the individuals are linked between these different data sets. And also a number of surveys joined into this. So within the IDI, there are two main data sources that we use. So the first is the 2013 census. So in particular, one of the things that we were getting from the 2013 census was the occupation, i.e. specialty. So when maybe a lot of you were here in 2013, you responded to the census, maybe you remember a question that says, what is your occupation? And you probably put down whatever your specialty is. So this is the data that we use to figure out who is working as a medical specialist in New Zealand at that time. We also get weekly hours worked from the census. So there were a number of questions, one of which is how many hours a week do you work in your main job and how many hours a week do you usually work in other jobs? And so we also use these variables. So unfortunately, in terms of the census, it doesn't have very good information on pay. So in order to get pay, we went to the tax system. So inland revenue, whenever there's an employer-employee relationship that goes through the PAYE system, then we're going to end up with an observation that's pulled into this data set of who paid who, how much, and this is on a monthly basis. So we can observe this totally confidentialised for everybody in the economy going back to April 1994. So the data that we use for these are from census month 2013, that was March, so pay being given to these medical specialists in all the different jobs that they might have been in. So the population that we're going to restrict to is particularly medical and dental specialists who are employed by a DHB, as indicated by saying in terms of the occupation that the occupation was a medical or dental specialty, and who received a salary in the tax data from a DHB in that month. So when we do this and pull these data together, we find a bit over 4,000 individuals. And looking at the number of doctors that we should find, that's fairly close to who we should find. So I'm sure you'll be curious about this. So these may not be exactly the way that doctors would want to categorise themselves, but these are the categories that are provided to us by Statistics New Zealand. So you can see they're fairly detailed, so cardiothoracic surgeon, neurosurgeon, fairly detailed levels of specialty that we have. One point to bear in mind, so I've put resident medical officer there in brackets, so in the full analysis that we do in the paper, we run some specifications where we include RMOs, but in the analysis I'm going to present to you now, we exclude them and just focus on the specialists. All right, so the most important variable that we're interested in is the hourly wage, and this is our main variable of analysis. So how do we construct this? So the census collects two aspects of how many hours people will usually work. So the first is the question is how many hours do you usually work in your main job? And I can't say for certain exactly how doctors would choose to answer that, but it may be that some would include, for example, hours that are spent on call. It may be that the hours that they report are not the specific hours in their contract, but what they actually feel that they end up working on a usual basis. So we also get from census the industry and the sector of the main job. And then in the tax data, so we see employees working for a number of different organisations, and we use the industry and sector of those organisations to match which main job in the census is which job in the tax data. So there are a few challenges that I'm not going to go into the detail of, but basically if the DHB job is the main job, or if the DHB job is the only other job, then we can combine the tax data and the census data to calculate hourly wages. So that we do lose a few observations, a few of those 4,000 specialists. So some people were just a bit busy and they didn't fill in their census forms very well, and maybe they didn't fill in how many hours they worked. Sometimes we're unable to match any of the jobs in the tax data to this job that they describe in the census. And sometimes the DHB will be one of multiple other jobs and we can't tell how many hours are worked in each. We also drop observations where the calculated hourly wage comes out at less than $15. So you might think, oh my gosh, that's like really low. And yes, it is. So we did experiment with increasing that. And actually what we find is that we're dropping a lot of low-paid women out when we do that. And so acknowledging that in these data that we construct, everyone's wage is going to be measured with some level of error. If we're throwing out all the low-paid women, then we're really going to underestimate the gender wage gap. So our preferred specification, we keep in these people who do appear to be earning quite low hourly wages. So once we've done all this data construction, we find about 3,500 specialists. So here's just a very brief description of what some of our data look like. So as you would expect, we have more men than women in our specialist sample. And quite a high proportion of the people that we have are working for the DHB as their main job. And the proportion is higher among men than women. So 86% of women, only 81% of men. A reasonable proportion of these specialists do have more than one job working for wages. So 10% of women, 14% of men. And an even higher proportion report in the census that they are self-employed. So we don't know exactly what they do in their self-employment, but it's likely to be private practice in most cases. And that is a lot more common among the men than the women. In terms of wages, when we move down to the bottom half of the table, we can see that just in the raw data, there are some pretty large differences in terms of median monthly earnings. So men, almost, 15,500, women only 10,000, though that does come from higher hourly hours worked each week for men, but still in these raw data there is a fairly large wage gap. So $69 an hour for women and $86 for men. And if these do seem a little low, recall that these data are from 2013. So our empirical strategy is relatively straightforward. So once we've constructed all these data, what we do is we run ordinary least squares regressions, with the dependent variable is the log of hourly wage in the DHB job. So an observation here, this is going to be our 3,500 or so medical specialists who are working for a DHB in March 2013. And then we have a number of basic controls. So obviously the control that's most interesting is a dummy variable for this individual being a woman. And the coefficient on that is going to tell us about the gender wage gap. Throughout our specifications, we're also going to control it for age. So either with a set of dummy variables that allow different age categories to earn different wages, or with a sort of really flexible specification that actually fits that graph that I showed you at the start really well. And then we have a number of additional controls that we add in, so specialty fixed effects. So as soon as we add in specialty fixed effects, we're comparing men and women in the same specialty. And then we also add in controls for the number of weekly hours worked in the DHB job and a variety of other personal and DHB characteristics. So this is the first set of results. So each column here represents the results of one ordinary least squares regression. So if we first concentrate on this left-hand column, so this is just the really basic specification that compares men and women of the same age. And what we see is that when we just compare men and women in the same age group, women are earning 11% less than men in the same age. We saw in that graph at the start that the gender wage gap actually seems to change through age. So in the second specification here, we estimate a separate gender wage gap for each age group. And what we see is that in the under 30 age group, wages are actually really similar, so 2.5% gender wage gap, and that's not statistically different to zero. When we move up to the 30 to 40 age group, we find that women now have a 10% wage disadvantage. Moving up to the 40 plus age group, that wage disadvantage has increased to 13.2%. Now you might say, okay, but what if women are working in lower paid specialties? So that's the next thing that we do. In the final column here, we add in specialty fixed effects. And what we see is that, so in the under 30 age group, that actually doesn't do anything. In the 30 to 40 age group, the gender wage gap decreases by about 1 percentage point. And in the over 40s, it decreases again by about 1 percentage point. So what this is saying is that, sure, women do tend to work in specialties that pay less, but only a little bit less, and this is a minor factor in the overall gender wage gap. So the next question that we're interested in is, so what you see in a lot of occupations is that women, because they have a lot more responsibilities outside work, are much more likely to work part-time, and part-time employees tend to get lower wages. So maybe that explains the gender wage gap. So in this case, we wanted to see, well, what happens to the gender wage gap when we account for how many hours a week specialists are working for the DHB? So the first column is just for comparison, and again, this includes age controls and specialty fixed effects, so we're looking within specialty here. So when we add in these controls for hours worked, what we find is the gender wage gap actually increases. So it increases from 9.2% to 12.5%. And that 12.5%, that is our preferred specification. So what we actually see in these data is that specialists who work fewer hours a week get paid more per hour, especially if they're men. So women who work fewer hours per week in their DHB job do get paid more per hour, but not nearly as much more as men get paid. And if we estimate within different categories of hours worked per week, we find that the gender wage gap is actually a lot higher among those who work fewer hours. So when we look at those who work 30 or fewer hours a week, then we find the gender wage gap is actually 23%. So that decreases, so when we move up a category to 30 to 40 hours, 40 to 50 hours, the gender wage gap is getting smaller and smaller. And by the time we're looking at the 60 hours or more, then the gender wage gap has fallen to 5.4%. So I think there are different reasons why men and women would choose to work few hours. So just from looking at the data, it's likely that men who work fewer hours are more likely to be self-employed and may have alternative employment in addition to their DHB job. Women who are working fewer hours, perhaps they have family responsibilities as well. So we're not trying to say that these men and women are exactly the same, just that if you look at what they're doing for the DHB, they're getting compensated quite differently for doing the same amount of work for the DHB. All right, so far I've been controlling for age in a really flexible way, and this is trying to account for experience. But you might argue, well, what if women were older when they got into the profession? What if they've taken more gaps in their professional working life, and therefore actually they're not as far along as they look given their age? So we ran a pile of robustness checks that are trying to tease out, okay, well, what if we actually control better for experience? So we can't tell for the full population when they receive their medical degree, but we can see in Statistics New Zealand's data for those who received a medical degree in New Zealand in 1994 or more recently. So for this piece of analysis, I restrict to that sample, which gives us 765 individuals. So the first column is just for comparison. This is basically what we did before. And we find among these individuals, we have a gender wage gap of 6.1%. So you'll notice that this is a smaller gender wage gap, largely because these individuals are younger, and the gender wage gap is smaller among the younger group. All right, so that's controlling for age. What if, instead of controlling for age, we actually use the dates when we observe them getting their medical degree and control for time since receiving the medical degree instead? So we do that in the second specification. The gender wage gap does fall somewhat, so down to 5.4%. And then we say, okay, well, even if we're looking at how long since a person received their medical degree, what if women have taken more time away from work, for example, because they had children? So that's what we account for in this third specification. So we run a bunch of additional analysis that estimates, using the tax data, that if a woman has a child, that will result in her reducing her lifetime months worked by an average of 5 months. So in this last case, we use the census report for women of how many live children have you given birth to, and for each child that a woman has had, we subtract 5 months off her experience. When we do the same estimation for men, we find men actually don't change their work at all when they have a child. So doing that in this final column here, we managed to reduce the gender wage gap, again, just a little bit. One point to bear in mind is that ASMS's MECA specifies that if you're away on parental leave for up to a year, you should be receiving the same pay increases as if you were at work. So actually, I think this final specification is an overcorrection for women taking time away. But even if we do this, at most we're reducing the gender wage gap by about 20%. So one obvious question is, okay, well, how does this vary by DHBs? Are all DHBs culprits, or are some sort of better than others? So we did this analysis separately by individual DHB. In those cases, we don't have so much statistical power because in some cases the sample sizes are getting a lot smaller. But in 11 out of the 20 DHBs, we did estimate a statistically significant gender wage gap, and some of those gender wage gaps were really large. In no cases did we find that women seemed to be earning as much as or more than equivalent men. So in this graph that I'm showing you here, so for confidentiality reasons, we've grouped DHBs together. We've grouped them into 3 size categories. So we've basically got small DHBs, that's the 8 smallest, then the 6 intermediate size, and then the 6 largest. And what I'm plotting here is women's wage as a percentage of the wage of an equivalent man. So we've got a point estimate and the 95% confidence interval. So you can see that small DHBs on the left have the largest gender wage gap. So women are earning about 81% of what equivalent men are earning, and we can reject that they're earning, 90% or more. Medium-sized DHBs, they have the smallest wage gap, but it's still about 9%. And the largest DHBs have a somewhat larger gender wage gap, about 12%. But in none of these DHB sizes are we finding that we can consider that there is no gender wage gap. Across the board, there is a large gender wage gap, statistically speaking. So we saw earlier that adjusting for women having children does seem to have an effect. So we also want to look more broadly. Okay, let's dig into that. So in this case, we use the census question on the membership of your family, and we particularly looked at men and women who are in a no-child family, in a one-child family, or in a 2 or more child family. And we separately estimated gender wage gaps for those 3 groups. So what do we see? We see that women with no children are still earning less than men with no children by 9.2%. In some analysis that I'm not going to show you here, but is in the paper, we looked at, in terms of how many live children have you given birth to as a woman. So this case here, if you've had children and they've grown up and left home, then they wouldn't appear as having children here. So in this no children category, that could be adult children who are long since independent. But when we look at how many live children have you given birth to, we still find a significant wage gap. I think it's about 5 or 6%. So it's not just that women who are parents are earning less than men who are parents. But women who are earning less, women who are parents are earning more or less than men. So here we compare women with 1 child with men with 1 child, and we find the gender wage gap is 13.6%. Or if we look at women with 2 or more children, 17.2%. And remember that this is in the context that most women who are medical specialists and have children don't take a lot of time off work, and if they take up to a year, they should be receiving the same pay increases. So clearly something else is going on. So in the final column here, we basically got the data and said, okay, what else might this possibly be due to? So we found a bunch of other controls and threw them in, and it really didn't make very much difference. So what were those controls? So one of the things that the MEC allows for is if you have higher qualifications, then maybe you're worth more, maybe you should be paid more. So one of the controls that we threw in was, what is your level of highest qualification? And we got that from the census. So is it just a bachelor's degree, is it honours or master's, or is it a doctorate? And we do find that specialists with doctorates do earn significantly more than those with just bachelor's degrees. We've seen before that there are some differences between DHBs of different sizes, so we can put in a control for different size DHBs, and we do find that the small DHBs pay somewhat higher than the medium-sized DHBs. We also know that specialists who have private practice may have different characteristics. Having that outside option outside their DHB employment may give them more bargaining power. We wanted to see, okay, well, we know that men are more likely to be self-employed, so let's put that in. Let's see if that's driving the gender wage gap. It's not, but we do see that specialists who are self-employed, i.e. probably have a private practice, do tend to earn more than those who are not. We also looked at whether specialists are foreign-born or overseas trained, ethnicity, so their social marital status, so they're currently in relationship, previously in relationship, or not at all, whether they live in a main urban area, whether they work in multiple jobs. So we don't have a lot of statistical power to distinguish these, but we didn't find that any of these mattered in a statistical sense. So overall, what is it that we're seeing? So we're seeing a gender wage gap among DHB employed specialists that can't be explained by specialty, can't be explained by experience, can't be explained by hours worked, and can't be explained by all the other personal characteristics that we could think of and throw in. So these findings, they are consistent with men being hired into higher pay steps in the Mecca than women with the same experience. And just from listening to people, I have heard anecdotal stories of this. Or it could be that men are disproportionately receiving those special benefits that are allowed for in the Mecca. So more broadly in the literature about gender wage gaps, some of the reasons that are put forward for these are discrimination, sexism, people see a woman, don't think she's as competent, don't offer to pay her as much, or that men have been taught to be more confident in asking for what they want and they go in and they bargain harder. So our results are consistent with either or both of these being a factor. Just a couple of points of discussion, questions that may have come up in your mind as I was speaking. So these data are from 2013. Do we think that things have changed since 2013? So I would say probably the overall gender wage gap, maybe it's not exactly 12.5%, but that is a really large gender wage gap, and as we've seen in other industries, that kind of wage gap doesn't go away without concerted action. So that gender wage gap, maybe it's not exactly 12.5%, but it's there and it's big, and you look around, and I know that there are a lot of believers already. I may have convinced some people who weren't believers before, but I'm personally convinced that yes, this is still going to be a major factor. So there are a few people, our data, you know, they're real world data, they are not perfect, and we do have a few people included in here who maybe ideally we would be able to control for or not include. So for example, medical officers and locums, if they specify that they're working in a specialty, they will be in the data. Are they going to be affecting our results? I suspect not much. So these people, they are also men and women, and so they're going to be contributing on both sides. If medical officers like RMOs have a smaller wage gap, we'd expect that that would actually bias our estimate of the gender wage gap downwards. And locums similarly can be men and can be women, and so part of the gender wage gap that we're going to be estimating will be the gender wage gap among locums, but they're a relatively small proportion, and they shouldn't be affecting the overall results that much. Private practice may be another concern. So we know that men are a lot more likely to work in private practice. So recall that in this analysis, we're only focusing on DHB earnings. So what are your wages in the DHB job? And we do have a number of specifications where we control for being self-employed, in which it matters in itself. It has a tiny effect on the gender wage gap that we estimate. So let me finish with our haiku. Despite union rules, doctors' gender pay gap still stark. No clear reason. Thank you.
Questions from the floor, please. Can we have some roaming mics?
Thanks. A very interesting presentation, a great piece of research. It's well done. I'm Andy Claver from Lakes DHB. One of the things that I noticed was that the gap is quite small the younger a person is in their training, and you've mentioned about time when they forget the first degree. I might have missed it, but did you correct for time to vocational registration? Because we as ASMS members with vocational registration are part of that mecca, and it just seems to me that if there's an opportunity for, it may well be that females decide to work during their training more part-time hours or have commitments to have children and decide to take that time off. Did you correct for that? Because that ultimately may affect which step you start on, and the gap seems to widen the further on you get in training.
Yeah, it is a good point that it matters not only when an individual got their medical degree, but also when they received their, when they became a specialist and entered these steps for the ASMS. Unfortunately, in the data, we don't actually have the date where they did receive their vocational registration. However, you'll notice that I don't think we can make that argument that it was women taking time off before they received their vocational registration, because we see a large gender wage gap even among women who've never had children. And we know from looking around at our colleagues, your colleagues, not mine, that a lot of women who are doctors who have children will wait until they've received vocational registration to do that. So I don't think we can believe that universally women are waiting so much longer to get vocational registration that would drive this gap. Secondly, if we look at what happens after about the age 45, we'll see that there's actually, so this will be the point where they've reached the top band of the MECA pay scale and there are actually no more increases. And at that point, men are just consistently earning more than women. It's not about experience because nobody's going anywhere with age. There is something that's happening there that's not about how long it's been since you registered as a specialist.
Me? Okay. This is rather shamefaced, but I'm going to say it. I'm female, right? So part of it is the gender stuff that you grow up with, and that unfortunately men don't ever have to live the experience unless they're different in their orientation themselves. But I would like to ask, how many women? I have never asked my hourly rate. I have never negotiated. I have lived on this concept of trust. So I have no idea if I've been underpaid at all. And, you know, if you can't trust your employer to treat you equally, how the hell?
I think that is a really good question. And I think part of the reason that gender pay gaps like this can persist is because we don't know. And I think that's the power of research like this, to show you, not for individuals, but as a whole, as a profession, there is a gender wage gap here. Somebody is being paid unfairly, and it is the women.
And the only other bit of contextual information around that notion of trust is this is where implicit gender bias comes in. And I would direct you all to read this fascinating but profoundly depressing study that they conducted in a science faculty in the States, where both men and women were circulated identical CVs where the only thing that was changed was the gender of the applicant, and both men and women both consistently rated the men as more employable and offered the men a higher starting salary. They were actually identical CVs. So this is where the significance of understanding the power of implicit gender bias has to be part of understanding this as well. Lucille.
Thanks, Charlotte. I'm PGY 30 next year. I held that with a badge of honour. But I think, so I've been around a bit of a while now, and as a clinical director over that period of time, I've had to constantly support junior woman consultants to battle for the same advantages that their male colleagues have had. And that includes saying, yes, you're negotiating for your starting rate, you're negotiating for your contract, it's like buying a house, it's like dealing with real estate agents. And that's the statement I use, and they look at me horrified to say, do I actually have to, can I ask for more? I never have to tell my male colleagues that. So that's the answer to your question.
Got a question?
Hello. Thanks very much for the presentation. Despite being an anaesthetist and having had to study statistics, I loathe it with a passion. But my question is more for the exec members. If we accept that the key here is the initial placement of women on the salary scale, and we've already heard some stories anecdotally about that being a problem, what's the union going to do to support women doctors, especially when they start their SMO position, to kind of eradicate this problem forever?
I'll actually ask Sarah to respond to that one.
So there is actually already a MECA provision that is supposed to make this an impossibility. So 12.2a talks about where you've already got a particular SMO, you know, with X skills and experience. When you appoint someone with the same or similar skills and experience, they are supposed to be put on the matching step, whether or not the person had started on the first step or the second step or wherever. We already have that clause. What that relies on are a couple of things. One, everybody knowing that that is there. 2, people getting good advice and support to ask that question. And the third thing is potentially a bit of an elephant in the room, which is pay transparency and people understanding what are the salary terms and conditions in place in your department or service at the moment. And I would also make that point in relation to special contribution allowances and recruitment and retention allowances. There is the clause about recruitment and retention talks specifically about when they're first put in place, ensuring that they are applied fairly across the service. But we are hoping to strengthen, we're going to try and do some work around the wording of that clause to strengthen it and make it not just when it's first put in place. Can I also say it's really important that you keep tabs on how long you've been on a salary step, because none of you are required to be on a salary step for more than 12 months. And if you move DHB, sometimes they try and give you a salary step, if they don't give you a higher step, and then they try and set your salary anniversary date 12 months from your start date, but you're actually entitled maybe to move up in 3 or 4 months to the next step. And if you don't engage with people on that, that can cause difficulties. We can and do help people with all of those things. And I often counsel SMOs, particularly women who are talking to me about their job offers, to go and ask the question and have the conversation. It's never a fun conversation to have, but always remember that the people that you're having it with are much more used to it than you are. And the worst thing that can happen is that they say no or disagree with you, and we can all move on from that. So it's definitely worth being supportive of your colleagues. And we will sometimes we'll know about special arrangements in already existing in services or departments, but we don't know everything about everyone everywhere. And so we will often counsel people to talk to colleagues in new services and try and get the lay of the land. And that's where the kind of advocacy that CDs like Lucille offer is really, really important.
Should we issue a standpoint on this issue now we've got this data, so that it does educate people about things?
Sure. Yeah.
Question at the front, and then we'll move over to here.
I'm Melanie Strader. I'm a psychiatrist and the head of department in Hawke's Bay. I think when I first came here to New Zealand, I was just told you paid according to your years of experience. There's the Mecca, that's it. There's your job. Now being the head of department and having a lot to do with recruitment and actually getting inside information into the salaries, the guys come in and they're just like, oh no, that DHB offered me this and that DHB offered me that, and 2 steps above. And so they're getting 2 steps above what the years of experience are. The girls come in and say, thank you for the job, I'm following the Mecca. It comes down exactly to that clause that's not being applied. If someone else was given 2 steps above, the new people coming in should also give 2 steps above. I don't know what that means for the DHB's finances, but and where that's going to end. But it is definitely, the guys are really hardcore negotiators and playing one DHB up against the other, and the girls aren't. So I think that is one thing. But the gender bias goes into so many different things. I think female doctors have to speak 3 times before they're heard. Males only need to speak once, maybe twice. So it goes much wider than salary. But that's one of the things I've picked up. Yeah.
We've got quite a cluster of questions, so we have the mic back to this table over there. To Bridget next, I think. Yep.
I'm Amanda Tristram, gynae oncologist here in Wellington. I was interested that you controlled for, to write it down, women work in specialties that tend to pay less, because my understanding is that the Mecca doesn't allow for specialties to pay less. And so my question is, should we turn that round and say DHB tend to pay less to specialties that employ more women?
So something that I meant to say before but didn't. Is that working? Yeah? No?
Can you hold the microphone closer?
Sure. I've got a very loud voice. It was just that it wasn't turned on. Anyway, the Mecca is a minimum rate document. It's not, and so, which often works in your favour. And we can leverage things in services where there's different demand or what have you. But in cases like this, and particularly where there isn't transparency around what's going on, then it can be a problem. I mean, I was actually also going to make, so, you know, it's something we need to look at, but we're about we want to raise the floor, we don't want to have to drop the ceiling to achieve what we're trying to do. So it's a big task. You know, we're about what we want to work for women, we want to work for all of our members, and it's not an either or, but so we're just, you know, going to, but yeah, it's a minimum rate document, so that has some issues with it. Yeah.
Bridget, and then Seaton.
Hi, Bridget from Auckland Hospital. Thank you. That's a staggering piece of research, and the statistics blow my mind. And I think those of you that know me in the room would suggest that I'm a reasonably assertive person, and I would have said prior to this that I was damn sure that I'm earning the same as my colleagues with commensurate experience. Now I'm not so sure, but I'm going back to find out. And so I have a sort of a comment and a question. You know, this is just one of a series of really good pieces of research that have come out of ASMS. And one of the things that was in the forecast budget was quite a significant increase in costs related to research, and I think that's really important work that we're doing. But this also harks back to the question that I think Roger raised about the additional subscription fees, and I think people need to feel that they're getting value for money. So my question to the panel is, we've got this research, what are we going to do with it?
So I'll respond very briefly before passing the baton, but the key way that we're angling this is it's actually up to the district health boards to conduct gender pay audits to fix this. It's their responsibility as the employer to prove that they're not contravening the Equal Pay Act. So that's our, not the Fair Pay Act, I keep getting the bloody things mixed up. So that's our key thrust. We don't want to suddenly have to deal with a massive influx of work from, but we probably are industrially, because this is going to generate a lot of queries, quite rightly so. So the key thing here is that we are pushing it back onto the DHBs as the employer, and Sarah can perhaps speak a bit more to that.
So we will clearly be taking this to bargaining, this information to bargaining next year with us. We will be pushing the DHBs hard to do their own gender pay audits, because it's the same sort of thing as Holidays Act stuff-ups. You know, first they have to work out and identify the issue in their own place and then decide how they're going to tackle it. But we do have a handful of cases already sitting with us, waiting to go, where we have got clear evidence of, I've got one case of a married couple whose vocational registration numbers are consecutive, you know, and he started 2 steps higher than her. So we may be able to save ourselves a court case now that this research is out, because I think we'll just go and say it's time to fix it. But and obviously any of you individually, if you think that's your situation and you can show that, of course we'll help you. So, but really it's going to be around the whole gender pay audit push and going into bargaining next year. Yeah.
So question from Seaton.
Just a comment, just to echo the comments from our 2 female clinical directors, Northland and Hawke's Bay, I think it is. I think we've got a problem, and there is a solution, and it's a multi-pronged solution. And I think there's a role, clearly, it's easy within departments to encourage transparency and equity. Between departments, it's not. But I'd encourage that there should be a role for the clinical directors of the departments to make sure that there is transparency and equity. That is almost our best way of approaching it. To give you an example, we had a sticky situation I'll mention briefly in Christchurch, only very briefly, where we had 3 new appointments, and there was a bloke in amongst the appointments. And the equity of various availability allowances was not being enabled by management. And in management there was the chief medical officer, a female, and the general manager, a female, and the lawyer, a female. And they weren't enabling this at all, basically, with the rest of the team. So we dug in, and we had legal advice, we had ASMS advice. They had a lawyer from outside of ASMS involved. That's how tense it got. And then we had issues of getting the transparency and equity within the salary step. That was yet another problem. So unless you fight for this sort of thing, I think you're going to undermine the whole process. And I think it's something that we in ASMS, in terms of, and we've been looking at it in terms of the roles of the clinical director before we get told what our role is, and rest assured it will be coming from management to some extent if we're not careful. It's best that we target some of this sort of thing so that we can set the standard of what we expect.
Thank you. Question there, then.
Kia ora te whānau, ko Hamish McKay tōku ingoa no Waikatahau. I'm Hamish McKay, I'm a paediatrician in Waikato. I'm clinical director of my department. I want to echo those comments by the women who've said about how they tend to say thank you very much and thanks for the job, and the guys turn up and go, so what's the other bits you meant to be giving me? Because as clinical director employing people, that is totally my experience. And thank you so much, Lizzie. You realise you're a bachelor pretending to be a doctor in a room when stuff like that comes out and what a real doctor does. I just wonder, with the JCCs, do we, just a random thought, do we need to ask at our JCCs those extra MECA payments, the gratuities, the whatevers, and so on, the stuff over and above the pay scale, just be nice to get a general report on where they're going. And I'll be honest, as a paediatrician, I'd love to know what departments are getting them. I'd also love to know what the split in gender is. Because, let's be honest, that's a huge fudge factor. You can hold them to account on the starting pay scale and stuff like that, but as soon as you go, oh, and there's other stuff you can do, that gives people open slather to say, oh, of course we need a third toe-ologist on this hospital, and here's another 100K to sweeten the deal. So maybe that's something, because again, those last three words of the haiku, no good reason, we need to find that reason, and that means drilling down to smaller data than what the census and so on can provide us, and that's going to be on a site-by-site, case-by-case basis.
So one quick tangible thing that we're doing pretty quickly off the bat is Izzy, myself, Angela and Steve, we're all going to the General Manager's HR meeting on the 5th of December, I think it is. So we're really trying to go straight to the heart of the problem and address this with HR managers at the district health boards around the country. I think Sarah wants to speak to your idea about the JCC data.
Yeah. So I guess I kind of hate saying this, but be careful what you wish for, because there are a bunch of DHBs who I think are looking quite hard at allowances, and particularly across the medical workforce. And some of them will see this as a reason rather than to match them, but to remove them. So, and that might not be a problem in terms of what you all think, in which case fine. But we probably need to be somewhat thoughtful about how we tackle that. But obviously JCCs are a good place to have some of those discussions. There's a great initiative at Northland where we all sat down, you might want to talk about it, Jenny, and actually blatantly compared what the after hours rates were across the different departments, and that was illuminating. Can someone give Jenny a mic? And then
I'm concerned about is that
yeah, and then we'll stop.
We've got one more. No, we've got two more questions lined up. So sorry, Jenny. Can we just have this question from the floor here?
Yeah, yes, it's on. Bethany Jones, neurologist at Hawke's Bay DHB. Like many of my colleagues here, I trained abroad and I moved up to New Zealand in 2013. They offered me 2 pay scales below where I thought I should be, and obviously I sought advice from ASMS as how I was supposed to approach this. And they said, well, actually, why don't you sort of negotiate and end up in the middle, and you just drop a pay scale where you think you should be, instead of empowering me and saying, no, you should ask for what you're entitled to. In fact, you've got a PhD, you've done a fellowship. Why don't you ask for a pay scale higher? I would have felt really empowered, and ASMS already gives us that advice. So my message is just be aware of that and just push us a little bit, because we'll feel really empowered to negotiate.
Thank you. Jenny, just quickly, and then I think we'll call it. Thank you.
I'm Jenny Henry. I'm work in Northland Anaesthetics. I've been the branch president for the last year, and I absolutely, I guess my mission is to exactly this, is to introduce transparency across the DHB SMOs in terms of pay. And while I won't obviously have any effect on what people come in on, but what we are doing is we sort of met after JCC, probably people from all specialties, and we had a whiteboard, and we actually wrote on the whiteboard what people, their hours, what they're getting paid for their extra hours. And there was a massive discrepancy in additional session payments. And I can't remember exactly what it was. Sarah took a photograph of it. But it's a good starting point. And so, what I'm doing is, we in anaesthetics, we've got a very, very good, well-defined additional sessional payment. And I've distributed that to various other departments. And I think that's the key, is get together and talk. And really, it sort of enables fairness, I think, as SMOs.
Thank you. Look, once again, I'd just like to thank Isabelle Sin and Bronwyn Bruce Brand and the team at Motu for their excellent, thorough, rigorous research. It's not going to be kicked for touch. The district health boards can't ignore this. So thank you, Izzy, for your wonderful presentation.